The air was thick with the smell of swamp rot and the dust of concrete as I stood at the border of what used to be my backyard, watching Karen from the HOA yell at a city inspector while her 800 pre-zero McMansion slowly sank another inch into the mud. Flash flood warnings blared from stationary squad cars. Frogs croaked from the front yards. And somewhere across the swampy wasteland, a rusted mailbox floated by like a funeral procession. Yes, that's me. You're probably wondering how we ended up here. I never imagined that a narrow creek flowing through my backyard would turn into a battleground. But that is exactly what happened. For years, that small stream was my sanctuary, my little prize. After long days working with welding pipes and crawling under houses, I would sit in an old folding chair beside the creek, a beer in one hand and a fishing pole in the other, although I never caught anything bigger than a curious bluegill. Dragonflies darted among the tall reeds. The air smelled of damp grass, and at night the only sound was the soft murmur of water winding through the rocks. It was a place you did not tamper with. Then the HOA arrived. Technically, the HOA had been around for years on the other side of the development, tucked away in their identical beige homes with matching mailboxes and suspiciously coordinated porch pumpkins. Every October, those of us living by the creek were the old-timers, the remnants from when this area was nothing but fields and dirt roads. Boundaries shifted, neighborhoods were absorbed, and before we even realized it, the HOA had crept into our lives like an unstoppable oil spill. My first encounter with their absurdity happened when a woman named Karen Mitchell arrived at my doorstep on a humid Saturday morning, clutching a clipboard as if it were a medieval shield. She wore pastel exercise clothes, though it was clear she had no intention of working out, and her smile carried the warmth of a tax audit. Introducing herself as the chair of the HOA Community Standards, I told her I was busy, but that did not deter her. She expressed concerns about my property, more precisely, about my creek. She claimed it was an unauthorized water feature that posed a serious safety risk to children and wildlife in the neighborhood. I looked at her as if she had just suggested my cat was running a Ponzi scheme. The creek was natural and had existed well before any of us arrived with our mortgages and zero-turn mowers. It was as much a part of the land as the trees and rocks. Karen was unconcerned. Karen had rules about fencing water features, rules about stagnant water, rules about appearances, rules and more rules. I politely told her that the creek was a protected natural drainage area according to my deed and county regulations, but she simply scribbled something furiously on her clipboard and stormed off, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and pure fury. 2 days later, I received my first. A violation notice was taped to my door using blue painter's tape. It accused me of having unauthorized landscaping features, unsafe open water, and attracting non-native species because, apparently, frogs are now considered invasive. I ignored it. A week later, I received a second notice, this time threatening a fine of $100 per day unless I submitted a plan to bring my property into compliance. I responded with a straightforward letter quoting county codes and enclosed a land survey copy showing the creek's status. They replied by arranging a mandatory inspection. During that inspection, 3 strangers I had never seen before wandered through my backyard carrying tape measures and smartphones, taking photos as if they were gathering evidence against me for some serious crime. Karen oversaw everything from the edge of my property, tapping her foot impatiently while I stood there with my arms crossed, daring them to step 1 inch into the creek itself. They did not, but they took plenty of notes. 1 week later, at the mandatory homeowners association meeting that I had no intention of attending before, Karen stood up in front of a mostly uninterested crowd of neighbors and declared my creek an immediate safety threat. She mentioned risks related to insurance, attracting wildlife, mosquito breeding, and the possibility of future erosion that could affect nearby properties. The irony of labeling a natural creek a hazard, especially while living beside a marshy area, was glaring. The swamp seemed completely beyond her understanding. When I rose to challenge her, she gave me a sweet smile and handed over a bundle of documents, insisting that I either enclose the entire creek, fill it in, or agree to weekly HOA inspections for the coming year at my own cost. I told her and everyone there exactly where to put those papers, of course, in a polite way. After that, things only worsened. I began discovering anonymous complaints about my unruly yard and failure to meet property standards left on my door nearly every other day. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked off its post. One morning, someone dumped a heap of landscaping stones into the shallow part of the creek, causing it to back up slightly and press against the banks. I even caught Karen herself one afternoon taking pictures of my yard from inside her SUV, which was parked across the street with the engine running like some kind of suburban detective. I refused to give in. I maintained the creek's natural state, kept the reeds trimmed, and ensured the water flowed freely. It was my land, my water, and my absolute right to enjoy sitting near it in peace. I should have known they wouldn't stop there. It all happened early on a Wednesday morning. I was sipping coffee on the back porch when I heard the low rumble of heavy machinery. At first, I thought it was city workers repairing the pothole on Maple Drive, but the noise grew closer and closer. I stood up just in time to see a small cement truck slowly reversing down the side alley beside my property, the house and the neighboring one. A man wearing a neon vest and a hard hat was guiding it as if he were parking a Ferrari, yelling at the driver over the roar of the engine. I hurried down the stairs and across the yard just as they placed the chute directly above the upper bend of my creek. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. "What on earth do you think you are doing?" The man in the vest barely glanced my way. "Just following work orders, sir," he replied. The drainage mitigation project was approved by the HOA. Before I could say another word, the chute swung down, and a thick gray slurry of wet concrete began pouring into the creek. I lost control. I rushed forward but slipped in the muddy grass and fell hard on my side, scraping my arm. By the time I got back up, the cement was already spreading like a toxic ooze, covering the pebbles, drowning the reeds, choking the water itself. Frogs jumped desperately to escape the flow, but some were too slow, stuck in the sticky mess as it hardened. The driver kept the drums spinning, casually filling the entire upper curve with thick gray sludge, while the man in the vest checked the clipboard and nodded approvingly. I shouted for them to stop, to show me the paperwork, to leave my property, but they ignored me. When they finished and drove away, my once beautiful creek had been transformed into a grotesque concrete scar, a silent, lifeless trench stretching across the entire yard. A slow fury seeped into my very bones as I stood there, soaked in mud and blood, staring at the smoldering remains of what used to be the heart of my home. Karen observed from the sidewalk, arms folded, grinning as if she had just triumphed in a chess match she believed I was unaware we were even playing. I wiped the mud away from my eyes, straightened my posture, and returned her smile without hesitation. Let her enjoy this victory. She had no clue about the tempest she had just set free. The first rain brought nearly a sense of relief after the long summer. A heavy gray blanket rolled in from the west, drenching the parched streets of our neighborhood with a refreshing rush of cool water. I sat on my porch, arms crossed, watching it arrive, my coffee slowly cooling in my hands as thick drops pounded the roof and transformed the lawn into a soggy mess. Normally, the creek would have easily handled the downpour, its gentle, babbling flow swallowing the runoff and carrying it downstream as it had done long before any of us called this place home. But this time, there was no creek to catch the water, only a long, hard, slick ribbon of concrete, useless and unyielding. I watched as the water hit the channel, swirled uncertainly, then began to back up, sliding across the lawn and filling the low spots as hesitantly as an old man trying to find his way home. Within an hour, puddles spread across my backyard like ugly gray bruises. By midday, the sidewalk in front was ankle-deep in muddy runoff. Small fragments of mulch and debris twirled lazily, caught in endless circles where the storm drains were blocked. Across the street, Karen Mitchell stood on her porch, holding an umbrella as large as a beach canopy, observing with a thin-lipped satisfaction as water crept up the curbs and soaked the flower beds. It only took 2 storms for the real troubles to begin. Mrs. Jensen, who lived at the corner, woke up to find her basement carpet squelching under her feet. Mr. Beast swore loudly, while Alvarez had to sandbag his front door when a river of runoff rushed down his yard's slope straight toward his porch. The gutters on Maple Drive overflowed so severely that the entire cul-de-sac turned into a stagnant pool, leaving a few unfortunate cars submerged up to their wheel wells in filthy brown water. Every time, without fail, the HOA sent notices blaming the homeowners. They cited improper lawn grading, clogged personal drains, and failure to manage water runoff according to HOA rules. It was never their fault. Not once did Karen or her group admit that by pouring concrete over the natural drainage path, they had destroyed the entire runoff system. It was as if the creek never existed, erased from their minds just like a guilty footprint wiped away at a crime scene. I stayed silent publicly. I attended the meetings and nodded politely whenever they showed satellite images with red circles marking the trouble spots. I observed as they approved new emergency regulations demanding required property drainage inspections coincidentally cost $250 per household. I acted the fool. While inside, I recorded everything, every storm. I roamed the neighborhood with my old Nikon camera hanging around my neck, posing as an amateur photographer. Quietly, I took hundreds of pictures showing flooded yards, submerged mailboxes, and water gathering in the freshly landscaped communal areas. I also kept a notebook filled with times, dates, locations, and notes on which houses were most affected. After the bigger storms, I even started flying my old drone to capture aerial views of how the water moved, or more accurately, failed to move. No one seemed to notice because they were too busy arguing. As the flooding worsened, tension among neighbors grew as well. Mrs. Jensen blamed the Alvarez children for blocking the storm drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons accused the Patels of creating a flower bed that allegedly redirected runoff onto their lawn. People who once shared beers and barbecue recipes were now filing formal complaints against each other, accusing deliberate water mismanagement. The HOA naturally took advantage of this. They selected Karen to lead a new flood mitigation task force, which mostly consisted of her sending increasingly harsh violation letters and pushing through emergency fines without any votes. Meanwhile, the drainage infrastructure continued to decay under the growing strain. The limited number of storm drains we had were never designed to manage the entire runoff of our neighborhood without the natural creek fulfilling its role. They clogged under the force of the storms just like a person struggling to breathe through a narrow tube. The streets fractured, lawns were washed away, mold spread up the sides of garage doors. Yet somehow the blame always ended up falling on the residents. One morning, I overheard a neighbor grumbling bitterly by the mailbox that maybe Karen should hold herself responsible for not controlling the weather. The sarcasm was as thick as the floodwaters. I stayed silent, simply offering a sympathetic nod, and slipped another batch of printed photos into my growing collection of evidence. It was not only the water that was rising. Resentment, heavy and unpleasant, was building pressure beneath the calm surface of our neat neighborhood like steam trapped under a cracked kettle lid. You could sense it in how people avoided eye contact during HOA meetings, and how whispered conversations stopped suddenly when certain board members passed by. And Karen seemed to feed off it. She paraded around wearing her HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star, savoring every fresh complaint, every new fine imposed on homes she disliked. One afternoon, she even paid a special visit to my door, fake smiling as she told me that because of continuing drainage problems, I was required to submit a complete landscaping plan for review by the end of the month. I asked, if the plan was supposed to consider the literal wall of concrete they had dumped onto my land without asking me, she just gave me a slow blink and said that any changes to the existing drainage systems would lead to more fines. I signed the documents with a smile, took her official-looking form, and tucked it into my ever-growing binder full of evidence. Let them dig their own grave. I was patient, I had time on my side, and I understood something they didn't. Nature never forgets. Water never pardons, and concrete, despite its arrogant permanence, cannot withstand forever the simple, relentless force of rain and gravity. It would not be long now. The cracks were already appearing if you knew where to look. I noticed it in the gradual but steady sinking of Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, in the expanding puddle that never fully dried at the bottom of the Hendersons' driveway, and in the way Mrs. Jensen's front yard seemed suspiciously tilted toward the road after the last heavy storm. The earth was shifting almost imperceptibly at first, like a cat adjusting before a leap, but it was moving all the same. all because they had attempted to cover something that was never meant to be tamed. I kept my head down, my mouth shut, and my camera batteries ready because it was no longer just me they had wronged. It was all of us. And when the dam finally gave way, I planned to have the best seat in the house. The third week of rain began like a soft drum roll. At first, just a faint murmur against the window panes. Then it grew stronger, swelling into a full-throated roar that darkened the skies and filled the air with the scent of damp earth and ozone. Weather alerts flashed across every channel, naming it a once-in-a-century storm, an unusual merging of cold fronts and saturated soil. But here in the neighborhood, it felt more like the end of days. The streets turned into rushing rivers overnight. Asphalt vanished beneath swirling gray currents dotted with bits of sod and broken mulch. Manhole covers released brown geysers into the air. Gutters tore away from houses with sharp metallic screams. The water overwhelmed the fragile structures. Lawns submerged under murky lakes that glistened under streetlights like a mix of glass and oil, and the houses, God have mercy on them. The cracks started small, fine lines spreading across driveways and sidewalks, easy to overlook if you squinted or dismissed them as normal settling. But then the real destruction showed itself. Long, jagged cracks stretching up stucco walls like lightning scars, door frames twisted until front doors would not close, garage floors warped as the ground below shifted. I watched everything unfold from my porch, in the same folding chair, clutching the same worn thermos of coffee, a quiet witness as nature took back what was hers. Across the street, Karen Mitchell. She stood in water up to her ankles, shouting into her cell phone, wildly gesturing at the lake that had swallowed her prize-winning rose bushes and now was lapping at the steps of her front porch. Her flawless suburban dream was turning into a swamp, and she was powerless to stop it. Naturally, she tried. The HOA reacted like frantic ants disturbed from their nest, hastily organizing emergency meetings at the community center, handing out sandbags from the back of a rented U-Haul, sending urgent emails that blamed everything from blocked city drains to unusually high tides. They hired a landscaping firm that specialized in quick water drainage solutions, which mostly meant dumping gravel into the worst puddles and hoping it would help. Karen herself led a campaign accusing the city of neglect, filing complaints, threatening to sue, and ranting about how their tax money deserved better drainage systems. But the truth lingered, heavy and unspoken, obvious to anyone who looked closely. The problem started where the creek had once flowed, right in my backyard. Naturally, the blame shifted once more. At first, it was murmured quietly among the HOA board members during their emergency meetings. Then, it appeared in passive-aggressive emails sent to all the residents. Finally, Karen made it official, storming up to my porch one afternoon with a clipboard and a violation notice that was thicker than a phone book, accusing me of negligent property management. Maintenance issues and failure to install proper drainage systems contributed to flooding in the neighborhood. Her voice shook with barely contained anger as she read the accusations aloud, water still dripping from the edge of her designer raincoat. I listened calmly, sipping my coffee, nodding at all the right moments, allowing her to release every bit of her frustration, fear, and rage. I signed nothing. I said almost nothing. I just wore that slow smile that made her eyes narrow with suspicion because I knew something she did not. I had been aware of it for weeks, quietly holding on to this knowledge like a trapdoor spider waiting for the perfect moment. They believed they had erased the creek with a few yards of concrete and some paperwork. But real creeks are stubborn. They are carved into the very fabric of the land, deeper than any human survey or homeowners association rule. The water had not vanished. It had merely gone underground, seeping through the soil, tracing its old roots, saturating each layer of the ground until it could no longer be overlooked. The foundations were cracking, not just because of blocked drains or heavy rains. They were cracking because the earth itself was shifting, swollen with trapped water, pushing against the unnatural barriers humans had foolishly put up. And I had evidence. Hidden in my files were drone photos capturing the initial minor pooling, aerial maps revealing the pattern. The slow, unavoidable movement of water toward the lower homes in the city continued. Floodplain maps had never been updated after the HOA made illegal changes to the creek. I even had a few discreet conversations recorded with contractors and surveyors who confirmed off the record that the HOA's alterations violated multiple county drainage regulations. But I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. No, things had to get worse. It had to cause pain. It had to break them. And judging by the rising tension around the neighborhood, we were almost there. You could sense it like the heavy electric buzz before a storm. In the way neighbors shot sharp, hostile looks at each other across flooded sidewalks. In the way voices escalated with anger during HOA meetings. In the way the once flawless lawns now bowed under the burden of mud and bitterness. Karen felt it too. She intensified enforcement, implementing new rules, new fines, and new inspections. She established a neighborhood improvement committee responsible for identifying homes that were supposedly contributing to the community's declining appearance. And guess whose name topped that list? I grinned when the notice arrived. 3 pages filled with vague allegations and barely hidden threats. I added it to my expanding binder and carefully slipped a copy into the waterproof container I had buried at the base of the old oak tree in the backyard, just in case. Because people like Karen, once they realize the ground is slipping beneath them, they grew increasingly desperate. And desperate people tend to make significant mistakes. All I needed was patience, and the land itself would take care of the hard work. It was already underway. You could observe it in the sagging frames of once stately doorways, the bent fences, and the cracked retaining walls. You could hear it in the anxious conversations at the coffee shop, the hushed whispers by the mailboxes, and the not-so-subtle for-sale signs appearing faster than mushrooms after a heavy rain. The neighborhood was decaying from the inside out, much like Karen's paper empire built on rules and regulations. Yet somehow, she believed she could solve the problem by forcing me into submission. She thought everything revolved around me. That was her critical error. This was never about me. It was about the land, the water, and ancient forces far older, stronger, and more patient than she could ever understand. Soon enough, she would learn that lesson in the harshest way. The thick envelope had been sitting at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, nestled between yellowed manuals and a broken box of Christmas lights I never used. I found it the night after Karen left the most recent violation notice on my doorstep, her smug smile still vivid in my mind. It was pure stubbornness that pushed me into the garage that night, flashlight clenched between my teeth, rummaging through old boxes until I uncovered the worn blue folder my grandfather had handed me when he signed the property over. "It might come in handy one day," he had said, then quickly refused to elaborate. Using the edge of a screwdriver, I carefully opened the envelope and discovered a treasure inside. Original land surveys dating back to 1952. A certified letter from the County Water Authority dated 1978, confirming a permanent natural drainage easement running right through what was now my backyard. Copies of state environmental protection orders recognizing the creek as part of a protected watershed. In other words, solid official evidence that my little creek was not just a charming feature, but a legally protected drainage corridor. One that no homeowners association, no matter how obsessed with control, had the right to fill in, block, redirect, or tamper with in any way. And that was exactly what they had done when they poured concrete over it. I sank down onto the cold concrete floor, the documents laid out before me like a winning hand, and exhaled slowly and deeply. They had made a huge mistake, but proving it would require more than just brandishing these papers at the next HOA meeting. I needed the right people to see them. People with badges, people with clipboards, people who could shut Karen down like a dam stops a river. So I started making calls. First to the County Water Authority, requesting an inspection of the property due to suspected unauthorized changes to the natural drainage system. Then to the City Environmental Office, presenting it as a concerned about possible wetland violations. I used my real name and provided accurate property information, but intentionally omitted any reference to the HOA for the time being. I wanted them to discover the crucial evidence on their own. While the bureaucratic machinery started to move, I focused on the second phase of my plan: anonymous whistleblowing. It turned out to be quite straightforward. I created a burner email account and composed a detailed message outlining the situation. This included aerial drone images, dated photographs of the concrete fill, copies of old easement papers, and links to county code infringements. I sent this to every local news outlet, the city newspaper, a couple of popular suburban Facebook groups, and just for amusement, the HOA gossip forum from which Karen had banned me last year. Then I waited. The wait was short. 3 days later, a white county truck moved slowly down my street, followed by another vehicle displaying the city emblem. 2 inspectors stepped out, one carrying a clipboard, the other with what appeared to be a surveyor's tripod over the shoulder. They carefully walked across the soggy sidewalk, avoiding the flooded lawns, and headed directly to my front door. I welcomed them inside, offered coffee, and calmly recounted the entire history supported by solid proof. They listened attentively, asked some direct questions, and spent the next 4 hours thoroughly examining the creek area, measuring the concrete fill, and collecting soil samples. Snapping pictures from every possible angle, I observed from my porch as they took notes, whispered quietly among themselves, frowned repeatedly, and eventually shook their heads with concern before climbing back into their trucks. Later that same evening, the first news report aired. It was a brief segment on the nightly news featuring a blurry aerial image of our neighborhood surrounded by a sea of muddy water. The reporter explained that unauthorized changes to the natural drainage system had worsened the flooding and might have breached several environmental regulations. Although they had not yet named the HOA, it was only a matter of time. The following morning, I discovered a certified letter stuffed into my mailbox, an official notice of investigation. It was addressed to the HOA, but it was clear that Karen was already aware. The way she barged into the emergency board meeting that afternoon spoke volumes. I stayed just long enough to see her approach the podium, her cheeks flushed, hair frizzy from the rain, and slam a thick pile of documents down before the stunned board members. She ranted about defamation, false allegations, and rebellious residents undermining the community. She accused the county of overstepping, the city of corruption, and the media of bias. Everyone was blamed except herself. Meanwhile, behind her, the projector screen flickered on, displaying images apparently taken from the whistleblower's files, photos of the concrete truck pouring into my creek, and maps outlining the natural flow of water. A right-of-way cutting directly through my property, images of the county regulations they had broken highlighted in bold red letters. The room fell completely silent except for the soft drone of the air conditioner. Even the board members, who usually agreed quickly with Karen's every command, shifted uneasily in their chairs, their eyes flickering to one another, to the floor, anywhere but at her. She was trapped, and she knew it. Yet Karen was nothing if not determined. She insisted the concrete was just a temporary erosion control, claimed the HOA was entitled to enhance the common areas, and even hinted she had verbal approval from a county official to proceed with the work. But when one of the more reserved board members nervously requested written documentation, Karen's lips clamped shut instantly. Because there was no such proof, and she was fully aware of that. That evening, the second wave of media coverage arrived, this time much more severe. The air was thick with terms like unlawful, irresponsible, and possible civil and criminal consequences being thrown around eagerly. Several residents spoke out, some on camera, sharing their anger, worries about declining property values, and fears regarding mold and structural damage. A local environmental advocacy group caught wind of the story and began circulating a petition demanding a thorough investigation and compensation for the homeowners affected. Within 7 days, the county posted formal violation orders on the doors of the community center. The city inspectors started knocking on doors not to hand out HOA fines, but to carry out property inspections concerning flood risks and the stability of foundations. Behind the scenes, lawsuits began to take shape. Rumors spread rapidly that several homeowners intended to sue both the HOA and individual board members for negligence and property damage. Right in the middle of this chaos was Karen, desperately attempting to stop the leaks in a vessel that was already sinking. She tried to gather her loyal supporters, the few dedicated rule enforcers who still trusted the justice of HOA leadership, but their numbers decreased with each flooded basement and cracked foundation. Karen attempted to control the story by portraying herself as a victim and accusing others of conspiracies, but nobody believed her anymore. Neighbors who once agreed with her complaints now crossed the street to avoid her. Board meetings, which were once full of angry attendees, now barely reached the minimum attendance needed. Her realm was falling apart, and she had no clue how to halt the collapse. I observed everything from my porch, drinking my coffee and browsing through the increasing pile of news reports and legal documents with quiet satisfaction. Karen might have had the HOA under her control before, but now the county, the city, the media, and the law held her by the ankles, pulling her down little by little. She had built her domain on arrogance and pavement, poured her false confidence into concrete, and in doing so, she had sealed her own downfall. They had completely overlooked the most fundamental truth. Nature always prevails. And this time, it was going to do so in a breathtaking way. The initial batch of city citations arrived with the force of a thunderstorm. Thick envelopes stuffed into the mailboxes of every HOA board member, each carrying the heavy weight of official government letterhead and legal jargon sharp enough to cut through steel. Karen's expression when she opened hers was priceless, something I would have gladly paid to witness. But the real drama unfolded later that same afternoon, when the city placed the first red tags on the front doors of a dozen houses, including hers. Labels reading unsafe structure, unstable foundation, and immediate occupancy restrictions pending repairs. In simple terms, their dream homes had been declared uninhabitable. I sat on my porch watching families stand stunned in the rain, gazing at the bright orange warning notices as if unable to fully grasp the reality. Within days, moving vans crowded the streets, engines humming while confused homeowners scrambled to salvage what they could from houses slowly sinking into the ground like a ship going down in slow motion. Karen fought back, of course. She hired a lawyer, threatened legal action against the city, shouted at inspectors in her driveway until her voice gave out, but it was all for nothing. The damage was glaring, the evidence undeniable, and the trail of negligence far too extensive to overlook. The final blow came from the insurance companies when the first claims arrived. Facing issues like water damage, foundation failure, and mold cleanup, the insurance adjusters descended like vultures, picking the remains clean. They called it negligence, violations of policy rules, failure to keep drainage systems properly maintained. Claims rejected, no compensation, no fixes, no chance. Without insurance funds, the homeowners were stuck. Their properties lost all value, their mortgages draining them financially. Notices of foreclosure started appearing in windows like eerie paper shades. Karen's house, once the jewel of the neighborhood with its tidy hedges and faux Greek columns, was the first to be declared uninhabitable. By the end of that month, she found herself living in a borrowed RV parked at the far edge of the development, its wheels slowly sinking into the very mud she had set loose. The HOA soon collapsed as well. At an emergency meeting inside the gutted remains of the community center, the few residents left voted to dissolve the organization. No celebration, no speeches, just a simple majority raised in hands soaked from the bitter rain. Karen attempted to speak up, but no one even bothered to respond. She was done, and she understood it clearly. The final financial report was read in a voice so empty it felt like a funeral hymn. Over $2,300,000 in expected legal debts, zero assets, and bankruptcy looming. A motion to dissolve the HOA immediately was made, seconded, and carried. Karen was last spotted dragging boxes of shredded papers were removed from the community center under the careful supervision of a city marshal. Yet the story did not conclude there. Even as the HOA met its well-earned end, the neighborhood faced a decision: either try to fix the broken system using the old methods or return to the original wisdom of the land. The vote to bring back the natural drainage passed with hardly any opposition. The county's environmental office offered grants aimed at restoring the watershed. Volunteers eagerly came forward to help. Some of the displaced homeowners, who had once ignored me, even volunteered to join in. For weeks we dug, shoveled, and planted, uncovering the once hidden earth beneath the concrete scars. We redirected the water along its original course, not by using pipes, pumps, or asphalt, but with native grasses, willow trees, and carefully positioned stones. When the creek first began flowing freely again, clear and joyful through my backyard, it felt like hearing an old friend call my name after a long absence. Sitting beside it with my legs dipped in the cool water, I smiled as the dragonflies returned. The frogs croaked among the reeds, and the land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But my work was not yet complete. One sunny morning, while the neighborhood buzzed with the sounds of rebuilding and renewal, I placed a small wooden sign at the creek's head, where it curved into my property. I carved the letters by hand, using a whittling knife, slow and deliberate, until the message stood out clearly, clean and striking for anyone walking by to notice. Nature always triumphs. It was not out of malice, it was not boasting. It was simply the unvarnished truth. Despite all their regulations, penalties, concrete, and arrogance, they had overlooked the oldest rule of all. No matter how tall you raise your walls, no matter how many documents you sign or seals you stamp, you cannot dominate the land forever. It remembers. It waits. And when the moment arrives, it takes back what belongs to it. Karen departed the neighborhood soon after that, pulling her worn-down RV behind a rusty pickup truck with a shattered rear window. No farewell gathering, no celebration, just a few curious looks and many sighs of relief. The house she once controlled now stood empty, half engulfed by the swamp she had helped create, a symbol of pride and foolishness. The new families who settled in never asked much about the history. They noticed the restored creek, the vibrant wetlands, the thriving trees and gardens, and were happy to let the land share its own tale. A better tale, one that lasts. Occasionally, I still find myself sitting by the creek, watching the water play over the stones, listening to frogs croaking at dusk, feeling the earth firm beneath my boots. I trace my fingers over the rough wood of the sign and smile quietly because I understand the price paid to secure this place. And I know that no matter what comes next, no matter who attempts to control it, possess it, or mold it, the land remains unchanged. The land will persist. It truly will. Remember this. It will overcome, just as it always has.